For the last several lectures, we've been considering the theme of energy and resources from the perspective of biological communities. And by communities, I mean assemblages of species that happen to live in the same habitat. More specifically, we've been looking at how species in a community might interact and how these interactions can tell us something about the abundance and distribution of those species. Now, understanding these kinds of ecological interactions gives us some insight into how energy and resources might help us to predict which species we might expect to find in particular places and in what numbers those species might occur. But ecological interactions between species don't tell the whole story. Understanding how predation or competition between pairs of species or even among groups of species can help us predict whether species might co-occur and whether they'll influence each other's population size if they do co-occur. But this knowledge isn't really enough to help us to predict what the particular species composition of an entire community will be in any habitat that we happen to look at. Actually, as we'll discuss much more later, it's really not possible to fully predict the structure of a complex biological community in the real world. There are simply too many factors, and as we'll see, especially too many historical contingencies or chance events that contribute to the specific composition of any assemblage of species that we find in a particular place. But it is possible to do better than we've done so far, to predict more about what we might expect to see in a particular area, even if we might fall short from doing so completely. To do so, however, we have to move up to yet another level, to a higher level in the organization of living things, to the level of what we call ecosystems. And that's what we're going to begin to do in this lecture and in the next lecture. We're going to ask first how energy flows through ecosystems, and then we're going to ask how nutrient resources also move through ecosystems as we turn to this highest level of biological organization in our discussion of energy and resources. Now, a simple reason that ecological interactions alone can't fully predict the structure of a biological community is that the environment itself plays an equally important role in many cases in determining abundance and distribution of species. Ecologists had long recognized this point, but the idea was formalized when the term ecosystem was first coined by a plant ecologist named Arthur G. Tansley, who wrote the following in an article he published in the journal Ecology, the premier journal in the field, in 1934. 35, I think, actually. And I'm paraphrasing this a little bit, but roughly what Tansley wrote was the following. He wrote, "The most fundamental conception of a community is the whole system in the sense of a system of physics, including not only what Tansley called the organism complex, but also the whole complex of physical factors forming what we call the environment. We cannot separate the organisms from their special environment with which they form one physical system. It's the ecosystems so formed, and that's where the word ecosystem was introduced, that are the basic units of nature on the face of the earth." So what Tansley was doing is saying, you can't just look at organisms, you've got to include the whole physical environment in which those organisms live, and they all function as a unit. They're not functioning independently. Nowadays, we would define ecosystems more simply and with less words than Tansley used, simply to read something like, an ecosystem is the group of organisms living in an area together with the physical environment with which they interact. Now, the key point of this definition is simply that we have explicitly included the physical environment as part of the system. And the reason we need to do this, as we'll see, is that the environment itself often determines how energy and resources move into and out of living systems. Thus, how the environment stores these materials, how it makes it available to the organisms living in a particular area are essential factors for explaining the abundance and distribution of species. Ecosystems can be described and studied at many different scales. I call it the most inclusive scale of biological organism, but that doesn't necessarily mean that ecosystems that we're interested in are large. A single pond might effectively be an ecosystem. But in this case, we're including not only the biological entities in the pond, but also the physical properties of the pond, the bank around it, and so forth itself. We might consider a much larger scale of ecosystems. We might consider the scale of ecosystem as being something like an entire tropical rainforest, the ecosystem, the Amazon basin. The savanna grasslands of Africa might be an ecosystem we're interested in. Or on an even larger physical scale, we might consider the whole planet as being an ecosystem, essentially the biosphere. Now, the central focus of ecosystem ecology is to understand how energy and nutrients move into and out of living systems. And a key point to understand here is that resources and energy can move through, or resources and energy happen to move through ecosystems in different ways. Specifically, energy flows through ecosystems in one direction. Let's consider the level of the biosphere, the entire planet. All the energy entering the biosphere, all the energy entering this ecosystem ultimately does so from the outside. Remember, we talked about how all the energy impinging on the planet or coming into the planet is coming from somewhere else, the sun. That energy is picked up, as we've seen, by living systems, is moved around those living systems in a way we'll describe in a second, and then eventually leaves the planet, eventually is lost to outer space in the form of heat. The planet, therefore, the ecosystem, the entire biosphere, is an open system with respect to energy. And this is true of ecosystems in general. Energy comes from the outside, gets into the ecosystem. It may move around the ecosystem, but eventually it leaves and goes away, dissipating ultimately into outer space. Now, other resources, and specifically here I'm talking about nutrient resources, the chemical elements that living things are made of, things like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and so forth, these are actually recycled in ecosystems and among ecosystems. They're used over and over again. From a planetary perspective, the biosphere is a completely closed system with respect to these nutrient elements. What's on the Earth today is all that we've got and all that we'll ever have, with the exception of an occasional meteorite that might fall from space. It's all being recycled. Now, in the remainder of this lecture, and as well as into the next lecture, we're going to contrast the movement of energy and resources in ecosystems to get an idea of what this tells us about the structure of biological communities. First, let's consider how energy flows through an ecosystem. As I pointed out at the very beginning of this section of the course, all of the energy used by living things ultimately comes from the sun. This energy is captured by photosynthetic organisms, plants and photosynthetic algae in the ocean and so forth, and in this way is made available to other living things. Now, it's important to point out that only a small portion of the solar energy that impinges on the planet or any particular ecosystem actually gets taken up. Consider, for example, a study of energy flow that was done in a forested ecosystem in the northeastern United States. This was a study done at a very well-known experimental forest called the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in New Hampshire. And what the researchers did here was actually carefully measure the total amount of solar energy impinging on this ecosystem. And they estimated that this energy was about 1,250,000 kilocalories per square meter per year. In other words, every square meter of this forest would get 250,000 kilocalories of energy landing on it from solar radiation. To give you some point of reference, that amount of energy would be about enough to light a 150 watt light bulb for the same period of time. So in other words, every meter of this ecosystem was getting enough energy from the sun to power a 150 watt light bulb. Okay. Now, by measuring rates of photosynthesis across a wide sample of different plant species that were found in this forested ecosystem, these researchers estimated that actually only approximately a little over 10,000 kilocalories per square meter actually was captured by photosynthesis. This means that less than 1% of the light energy impinging on this ecosystem actually was captured by it. Okay? Now, in different kinds of ecosystems, the amount of solar energy that's captured may be a little bit more or a little bit less, but at best it's only going to be in the range of a few percent. So there's a lot of energy that's reaching ecosystems from the sun, but only a small proportion of it, a surprisingly small proportion of it, is picked up. The remaining energy that impinges on that ecosystem might warm it up physically, but ultimately that energy is lost as the heat dissipates. Now, the total amount of energy that is captured by the photosynthetic organisms in an ecosystem is what we call the gross primary productivity of that ecosystem. The word productivity here is revealing because productivity implies that we're producing something, and indeed we are. We're producing living matter. Okay? We refer to the photosynthetic organisms that are doing the job of capturing this energy in an ecosystem as being the primary producers, or sometimes we just call it the producers of the ecosystem. Now, the gross primary productivity is depends on a number of different factors in addition to the amount of energy available for sunlight. Now remember, in that forested ecosystem of Hubbard Brook, there was a huge amount of energy that was impinging on the ecosystem that never got captured. In other ecosystems, solar energy might indeed be limiting. Right? It may be that there's an ecosystem that is existing in a more shaded area, for example, underneath a forested canopy that we're interested in. There, light itself might limit the productivity of an ecosystem. But even if you have all the light you need, say as Hubbard Brook might in this case, there are other factors that limit productivity in addition. These factors include specifically critical mineral nutrients, such as the things we've already mentioned, things like nitrogen and phosphorus, which those primary producers need to simply build more of themselves. If they don't have those nutrients, it doesn't matter how much energy they have, they can't make the organic compounds that they need to build themselves from. In terrestrial ecosystems, water itself is often a limiting factor. In dry areas, the amount of productivity that an ecosystem can display is limited by the amount of water. And of course, we know that water is an important input into the process of photosynthesis. Without water, plants can't photosynthesize, they can't build more of themselves. Not surprisingly, temperature often limits productivity. We find productivity to be much higher at lower latitudes, where it's warmer, than we do at higher latitudes. Why? This is actually largely a matter of protein biochemistry. Right? Remember, proteins function better at optimal temperatures. If it's too cold, then the enzymes involved in photosynthesis can't work as efficiently. And so we have lower productivity. These kinds of other factors are what affect the amount of energy that is turned into organic matter through photosynthesis in an ecosystem. Well, now once we've got some of the solar energy that impinges on an ecosystem captured in some way by the primary producers, what happens to it? Now, the most important thing to realize here is that only part of the gross primary productivity of an ecosystem actually becomes available to the rest of the ecosystem. Plants use much of the energy they capture for their own maintenance. That is, the producers in an ecosystem use some of their gross primary productivity as fuel for their own cellular respiration to make more ATP. This is a point that we talked about when we talked about photosynthesis. Remember from our discussion of cellular respiration and photosynthesis, by the way, that the output of the Calvin cycle is that molecule we called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, or G3P for short. G3P can be fed directly into the glycolytic pathway, because remember, G3P was at the energy peak of the glycolytic pathway. So what happens literally is that a lot of the energy that plants are capturing and using to build G3P, this primary organic compound, is simply shunted right over to make ATP. And why do the plants do that? Because they need ATP just simply to power themselves, to keep themselves going. Now, how much G3P is used in respiration versus used to support anything else that the plant does really varies from species to species. There are some species of plants that will use a lot of the energy they capture for their own maintenance, and there are other species of plants that actually will use a lot of the energy they capture to do what? To build more plants, right? More of themselves, to grow and to reproduce. Because the other thing that can happen to this captured energy that's been turned into organic carbon compounds is to use those carbon compounds to build more plant parts, right? Usually, though, it's much less than half of the output of photosynthesis that is used by a plant for growth. And in many cases, in many species, it's only on the order of as little as 10%. So in other words, a lot of the gross primary productivity is essentially useless from the point of view of the rest of the ecosystem, because the primary producers themselves just use it right up. When they burn that ATP, the energy is lost and again leaves the ecosystem. Now, there is some portion of this gross primary productivity that is used to make plant tissue, and that's the portion that can then penetrate the rest of the ecosystem as those plants are eaten by other organisms. We call this portion of productivity that is available to the rest of the ecosystem net primary productivity. That is, net primary productivity is equal to gross primary productivity minus the energy used by the producers themselves for respiration. Now, when people are measuring productivity, net productivity of an ecosystem, they often measure this in two different ways, which I think is revealing. They can express net productivity in terms of the amount of energy captured, in terms of, for example, joules per meter squared per year, joules being a common measure of energy. Or they often express it in terms of the amount of organic matter by weight, what we call the biomass that's produced. And we might measure that in terms of grams per meter squared per year. The exchangeability of these two terms in measuring productivity illustrates what's going on here. Energy is being converted by primary producers into organic matter by photosynthesis. Okay, well, understanding productivity and factors affecting productivity tells us how energy and how much energy enters an ecosystem. But what happens after that? How is it that net primary productivity that's harvested by an ecosystem is then harvested by the animals that eat those plants and distributed throughout the rest of the ecosystem? Now, you might think, given our discussion of ecological interactions, especially predation, that this could be pretty complicated. Because you might imagine if you go into a real ecosystem like the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest or the Amazon rainforest, that there are going to be a huge number of ways that this energy is transferred around the ecosystem as different organisms eat each other. And indeed, that's true if you look at the specifics, but fortunately, we can simplify the problem by grouping together different kinds of organisms in an ecosystem according to their source of energy, and more specifically, according to how far away they are from the primary producers in an ecosystem. Organisms that obtain their energy from a common source, or really a common distance from the primary producers, constitute what we call a trophic level in an ecosystem. Now, the primary producers that we've been discussing are the lowest trophic level in an ecosystem. These primary producers are the autotrophs that capture energy from sunlight. Okay? In a terrestrial ecosystem, we think of these things as being plants, grass and grasslands, trees in a forest. In an aquatic ecosystem, the primary producers are usually various kinds of algae or photosynthetic bacteria, generally known as phytoplankton. Okay? Now, all the other organisms in an ecosystem are not producers, but they're consumers. They're heterotrophs. And so we can lump all the other organisms in an ecosystem as the consumers of the ecosystem. And we can further subdivide these consumers, and here's the point, according to how many steps removed they are from the primary producers. Consumers that obtain their energy directly by eating the primary producers are what we call primary consumers. In a terrestrial ecosystem, for example, primary consumers are any kind of herbivore. This could be something like a plant-eating insect or a grass-eating mammal, even something as big as a wildebeest or a bison. Okay? In an aquatic ecosystem, the primary consumers are usually kinds of what we call zooplankton, which refers to any number of kinds of different tiny animals that live by eating the phytoplankton in that ecosystem. All right, kids, so those are the primary consumers. Now, there are organisms that specialize at obtaining the energy that they get in an ecosystem, not by eating the producers, but instead by eating the primary consumers. The common name for these animals are carnivores. They make their living by eating other animals. All right? So they have to eat something that got its energy from eating a plant. So we call them secondary consumers because they're 2 steps away from the primary producers. Interestingly, we can go up the chain. There are also animals that are specialized in eating secondary consumers. These would be top-level predators, okay? And we would call these tertiary consumers. They're 3 steps away from the primary consumers. We can even go higher. In some ecosystems, we might define what we would call quaternary consumers. Very specialized organisms, top predators that are actually eating very high on the food chain, as we would say. Now, I just introduced a term here, food chain, and that's how we refer to these trophic levels if we think of them as being organized in a linear fashion. We have producers that are eaten by primary consumers, that are eaten by secondary consumers and tertiary consumers, and on up the ladder of the food chain. Now, there's another important class of organisms that we haven't mentioned yet that actually are kind of aside from this food chain, and these are organisms that we call decomposers or detritivores. Decomposers are the organisms that specialize actually on eating waste products and dead things that haven't been eaten by anything else. Decomposers are things like bacteria or fungi in some simple cases, but they also could be very complex organisms like earthworms or vultures. What these decomposers or detritivores are doing is eating the leftovers that sort of have fallen out of the food chain, and we're going to come back to them later on. Now, in the real world, ecosystems rarely are organized in such a simple linear fashion as a food chain might suggest, and instead what we see is something more complex that we would call a food web. A food web, as the name suggests, is able to depict more complex connections among the various trophic levels that we would see in an ecosystem. Now, one of the reasons that it's hard to characterize trophic relationships in a single chain is because many consumers fit into more than one trophic level in an ecosystem. For example, most rodents are primary consumers because they eat plant parts such as seeds. But rodents also can be secondary consumers when they eat insects, which themselves have eaten plant parts. Now, the point of all of this is to illustrate how energy flows from lower trophic levels in an ecosystem to higher trophic levels. And that's the way energy moves, from primary producers on up through trophic levels, and eventually, if there are any in the ecosystem, up through the highest level consumers in that ecosystem. Now, the amount of energy that is eaten by consumers in an ecosystem that gets converted into biomass of those consumers is what we call the secondary productivity of the ecosystem, right? This is contrasting with the primary productivity. We're now taking energy again, but not from sunlight, but actually from the plant's own bodies, and moving it into different trophic levels. We are producing more organisms at these higher trophic levels, and we call that the secondary productivity of an ecosystem. Now, the key point about secondary productivity is that a lot of energy is lost at this transition, and in fact at each transition from one trophic level to another. This energy is lost in one of three ways. First, some energy is lost because the organisms that are acting as consumers use some of the energy that they've consumed to power their own production of ATP, for their own cellular respiration. In other words, they're using this energy for maintenance. They're not making more of themselves. They're not growing or reproducing with this energy or biomass that they've consumed, but simply burning it off. And once that energy is burned off this way, it again is lost from the ecosystem. Now, some of the energy also is lost as it moves from one trophic level to another, because not all of the biomass that is consumed by a consumer actually can be assimilated by that consumer, right? Not all of the biological molecules that a consumer takes in when it eats something can actually be broken down and used to build more of that consumer or to power its production of ATP. Instead, that biomass passes through the consumer, and it's lost as some sort of waste product, literally as feces. So we have another source of loss from the transition of energy from one trophic level to another because of essentially inefficiency or the inability of the consumer to take advantage of that source of energy. Finally, some energy is lost between trophic levels as it moves from one trophic level to another. Or I should say, some energy is lost in the transition from one trophic level to another because it's actually never eaten, right? Not all of the plants in an ecosystem are going to be eaten by herbivores. Some of them just never get eaten, and they die. Their bodies, all of the net productivity that went into making more of these producers is also lost from the ecosystem. It's never consumed, it never passes up to a higher trophic level. Now, actually, waste products and the dead bodies of unconsumed organisms in an ecosystem are not completely lost from the ecosystem, because this is where the detritivores come in. This is where the decomposers come into play. Because these decomposers are specialized in capturing the energy from these waste products and using it to power their own production of ATP or to build more of themselves. Now, eventually, essentially, this energy is shunted away from the ecosystem. Only if these decomposers themselves are eaten by a consumer will that energy get back into an ecosystem. So, for example, an earthworm is acting as a decomposer in a typical terrestrial ecosystem. If a turtle comes along and eats that earthworm, then some of the energy gets shunted back in. If it doesn't, then that energy is simply lost from the ecosystem. Okay, now, how much energy actually gets from one trophic level in an ecosystem to another? And again, the answer is surprisingly little. It depends on the ecosystem and it depends on the organisms involved, but in general, about less than 5% to maybe as high as 20%, but no more, of the energy available at a lower trophic level in an ecosystem ever gets incorporated into the next trophic level up. And in fact, a commonly used average value is about 10%. Okay? Now, there's an important consequence of the fact that so little energy can move from one trophic level to another. Basically, of the consequence of the fact that what we would call ecological efficiency or trophic efficiency is relatively low as energy moves from between trophic levels. And the consequence is that there's less and less energy available at higher trophic levels, so we find fewer and fewer organisms able to exist at these higher trophic levels. Now, we can represent this loss of energy from one trophic level to another as we move to higher trophic levels in an ecosystem in a couple of different ways. One common way to represent this is in terms of what we call variously an energy pyramid or a productivity pyramid. You can imagine an energy pyramid by picturing essentially a series of rectangles stacked on top of each other, with the lowest rectangle representing the primary producers of an ecosystem, the next rectangle up representing the primary consumers, and so on. Now, if you represent the movement of energy, the amount of energy available at different levels in an ecosystem this way, what you find is that each rectangle, as you move up, is very small. It would be only about 10% the width of the rectangle below it. In other words, for example, in one particular study that's often cited, researchers measured in a typical terrestrial ecosystem about 10,000 joules of energy, joules being a common measure of energy, were available in the primary producers of this ecosystem. But when they looked at the level of primary consumers, they only found the equivalent of about 1,000 joules of energy. In other words, 10% of the energy available at the lower trophic level. And when it moved on up to the next level, they only found 100 joules of energy. And in fact, when they moved on up to the level of what we would call tertiary consumers, they only found the equivalent of 10 joules of energy. In other words, there's very little energy that penetrates into the highest trophic levels of an ecosystem. Another way to represent this is simply to count the number of individuals occurring at different trophic levels in an ecosystem. This is, of course, hard to do, so we have to estimate it, but I'll give you another study that's often cited. For example, in a grassy field in Michigan, researchers estimated in a particular plot that there were about 5,800,000 primary producers, mostly individual grass plants, living in that ecosystem. By the time they got up to the tertiary consumers living in that ecosystem, they estimated that there were only 3 individuals. In other words, close to 6 million plants were necessary to support the life of only 3 top predators in this particular ecosystem. This is why we find so few predators in the world as compared to the number of plants or herbivores that we find in the world. There's simply not enough energy getting to these higher levels of organization, these higher trophic levels in the ecosystem. And therefore, it's the movement of energy or constraints on that movement, the ecological efficiencies that are determining the relative numbers of different kinds of species at each trophic level in the ecosystem. Well, this gives us some idea about the movement of energy flowing through ecosystems, and how this movement of energy and the inefficiency of transfer of energy from one trophic level to another tells us something about the organization of an ecosystem. In the next lecture, we're going to look at how nutrients move through ecosystems, and as we'll see, the story there is really quite different.